up, everybody in Codex? This is Dan here doing another interview with an absolute comic book legend, J.M. DeMatteis. Did I say it right?
Got it.
Awesome. That was the one thing I was afraid I was going to mess up was your name. So I'm glad we're starting off on a good foot. So thank you for taking some time out of your day to sit down and talk with us. Really been looking forward to this. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. As I was looking into you, I read that originally you had wanted to start as an artist, but you ended up switching your focus to being a writer. So what made you decide to switch from art to writing?
Yeah, it's so funny. I think if you poke under the skin of 90% of comic book writers, you'll find a hidden artist somewhere. I don't. When I was a kid, art was my thing. That was my first passion. I spent a good part of my childhood on my living room floor with a stack of papers and crayons and pencils and drawing. And then after high school, at the end of high school, I got accepted into the School of Visual Arts. And I was just a dumb working class kid from Brooklyn, and I came home with all this information from my parents, and they said, "We can't afford that." And I literally didn't know there was such a thing as financial aid, anything. So my parents said, "Oh, we can't afford that." I went, "Oh, okay," and off I went to community college. And after that, although I still would draw, I always wrote as well. Writing was always an interest of mine. I remember being like 6 years old and deciding I was going to write a novel and looking up publishers in the yellow pages. I never wrote anything, but I had fun looking up publishers, But writing just started becoming more ascendant, And there was a period there where I was playing a lot of music, playing in rock and roll bands. I started doing music journalism at the same time. So that was a great way to kind of flex both muscles, to indulge my writer self and my musician self. But I was always a comic book guy, always a comic book fan. I wasn't one of those people that ever grew out of comics. I'm still waiting to grow out of comics. It hasn't happened.
I think we all are.
Yeah. Well, I know some people that like at a certain age, they kind of grew out of them and they rediscovered them in college or something. And I just didn't matter if nobody I knew read them. I was still always reading them. And so that was always one of my goals. And so I just kept knocking on that door and banging my head against that wall until it finally cracked and I started selling my first scripts to DC.
Yeah, I read that you had made a bunch of pitches to DC that weren't accepted before you got one that was. Do you remember what any of those pitches were? Was it anything that you ever revisited after you?
I have all the letters, because the first guy I sold to was Paul Levitz. Mm-hmm. I have all his rejection letters. And I was just telling somebody about this. I sent. Long story short, when I sent in the first batch, I had sent in some samples and someone said, if you really want to break in, they had those anthology books back in those days, House of Mystery, Weird War Tales, House of Secrets, all those books. That's where they broke in new writers. I had never even heard of those books. I was a superhero guy. I didn't even know those books existed. I ran out, I bought a bunch of them. I read them. I wrote up a bunch of pitches. I sent them into Paul, who, God bless him for even reading them. Who was I? Was absolutely nobody. He took the time. He read them. I'm thinking I really need to go copy this letter and put it up on Facebook or Blue Sky or whatever, just to inspire people, because he shredded my stories, just shredded them to pieces. But at the very bottom, it said, "Please feel free to submit again." And to my mind, everything else, I didn't see it. All I saw was, feel free to submit again. So I submitted again and he shredded my stories. I submitted again. He shredded my stories. I lived in Brooklyn. DC was in Manhattan. So I said, "Can I come up and, meet you in person and pitch you some ideas in person?" Which he did. So that, just to do that was a thrill, just to go into the DC offices. And I pitched him a bunch. There was one that he liked. We talked about it. I went home. I wrote a script. He shredded it. I rewrote it. And then he bought it. And to this day, that moment, sitting there with Paul, he shook my hand and said, "Welcome to the business." And that was like,
that's awesome.
I didn't need to take the subway home. I could have floated home. You know what I mean? It was great. Really wonderful moment that I've never forgotten. Paul is very important in my career.
Yeah, I think the person that always gives you your start is,
Yeah.
is one of the ones you always remember. So like I said, are there any of those pitches that got rejected that, once you got your career going that you kind of revisited and said, you know what, if I
I'm
work this out
I
into something else,
yeah.
it'd be good.
I don't have them, but I'm sure I did, because one thing I learned very early is hold on to your ideas.
Yeah.
You can always find another way. You can always, they will evolve. They'll turn into slightly different stories, but I've had certain stories of mine that have taken 15, 20, 25 years of nurturing before I was able to sell them. Lots of rejection along the way, but it's always good to hold on to those things, because you'll always find a doorway somewhere, so I'm sure like I said, I don't really remember what the initial pitches were. One of them, I think, now that I'm thinking about it, you're tapping these memories that are all the way in the back of my head. I think one of them, I know I eventually reworked and sold to House of Mystery, or one of those books. It was called
Nice.
The Wheel of Karma. That's all I remember about it, was the name. And I think somebody literally got run over by the Wheel of Karma at the end of the story.
Well, I saw one of the earliest things you did for DC was create the Creature Commandos, and now they're turning that into that animated series, and it's going to be like
Yeah,
kind of start
amazing.
of the whole new DC thing. I mean, that's got to be a pretty cool thing that your creation is the one that's kicking off this whole new era of DC film and television.
It's weird and wonderful, because that was that was literally the beginning of my career. I was selling to Paul at Weird War Tales, and you're always scrambling. I got it. What's the next story? I was getting paid. I think my starting rate was $13 a page back then, which helped pay the rent and buy a slice of pizza. So I was fine with that.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking, well, it's Weird War Tales, Weird War, monsters, World War II. It seemed like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But what happened was I sold stuff to DC for about 6 months, and then the infamous DC implosion happened.
Oh,
For those that know about that, where basically 2/3 of the line got scrapped. And the first people that got thrown out at the door were the newer people like me, who had just started selling. So I didn't get any work out of them for, I don't know, 9 or 10 months. And then eventually I got back in the door. I started working with Len Wein, who became my mentor, my friend, wonderful guy, amazing writer, great editor. And he was looking for series for Weird War. He was now editing those books. So he wanted a series for Weird War Tales. He wanted a series for House of Mystery. So I dusted off this Creature Commandos idea. I don't think I had that title. I think Len and I came up with it between us, or maybe he came up with it. I don't remember. And I sold it to him. And so, that was 150 years ago. And I did those early stories, and then I left DC and I went over to Marvel. And who thinks about the Creature Commandos? And like, what is it? 40 years go by, and I get an email from some comic book journalist I know, going, I want to ask you some questions about Creature Commandos. And I'm thinking, what? Why? And the next day, this big DC announcement comes out, and I'm like, you just never know.
Yeah.
You just never know. And James Gunn was nice enough. About a month or so ago, we had a little Zoom chat, and we talked about it and some other things. And really, really nice guy. Seems to really know and love the DC universe. He's a real fan, So I have, Creature Commandos aside, I have very high hopes for what he's going to be doing with the DC universe coming up. So, but yeah, so especially now with Marvel and DC developing everything in sight, you never know what weird, obscure thing you've worked on is going to get turned into a movie or a TV show.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was going to ask if they had like reached out to you to consult on it at all, but did he give you any kind of behind the scenes tidbits about what to expect in it or anything
We
else?
talked about it, we talked about it a bit, but whatever we talked about is nothing I would ever share, because
Oh yeah, I wouldn't ask
yeah,
you
yeah. But he was,
that.
he talked about that. He talked about some of the other things he's working on. It was just really nice of him to take the time and have a chat about it all,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like they said that's pretty cool that the thing that you created so long ago is now going to be back in the spotlight in a major way.
Yeah, the other thing that I created at the same time for House of Mystery was a series called I, Vampire. So
Oh
now, well, now I'm waiting for the I, Vampire movie. It's like,
yeah.
you did Creature Commandos, let's do I, Vampire now.
Well, and then they just used I, Vampire in the DC Vampires miniseries.
Oh, I didn't even realize. Oh, that's
Oh,
good. I'm
yeah,
glad he's still
yeah.
out. Glad he's still out there. Yeah, it's so funny. I got to revisit that character because I don't know, a few years back I was writing Justice League Dark, and he was part of the series, so it was fun to revisit that character after all those years.
So you mentioned the DC implosion. Uh, we won't go into detail on that. You know, anybody that doesn't know about it can certainly Google it. But like, there's
Yeah.
a bunch of stuff they got rid of. So after you were at DC for a couple years, it was in 1980 you went to Marvel. Was that the reason that you started at Marvel, or was there
No,
some?
no. What happened was, I sold that first script to DC. This is how long ago it was. It was December of 1977
Wow.
when most people watching this weren't born, right? And I sold scripts to them for about 6 months till about June of 78. And that's when the implosion happened. I remember the implosion happened and my band broke up at the same time. So I
Oh,
was just completely adrift, It was a rough summer. And but in the meantime, I was doing journalism, and as part of the journalism that I was doing, I did some articles about comics. I did a cover story in a paper called the Soho Weekly News, which was sort of like the Village Voice in New York at the time. So I got to interview, Shooter and people at DC and Neil Adams, and so you always want to make contacts and keep your foot in. And through Shooter, Shooter got to read my work. So while this stuff is going on and I'm waiting for DC, Shooter would send me, give me fill-in work. He used to send me, he gave me some really interesting odd jobs. My favorite of which was because he took an interest in my work and he wanted to eventually bring me over to Marvel. My favorite job that he gave me, they were suing some animation company. There was a character called Web Woman, and they said it was basically a ripoff of Spider-Man. So they needed someone to come in and watch these Web Woman cartoons and write up notes for the lawyers about similarities between Web Woman and Spider-Man. So now get this, Stan Lee is in California somewhere. So where did they put me? Stan Lee's office.
oh wow.
So for 2 weeks, get this, for 2 weeks, I am paid to sit in Stan Lee's office and watch cartoons.
that,
Is that like the best job ever?
that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I think you could say now, this many years later, did you kind of open up some drawers, take a peek at what he had? They're like, oh, what's this? What's
No,
this?
I did not poke. I didn't poke in Stan's drawers. But anyway, so that's what was going on. And then the door opened up at DC again. I was getting work there, but I was still, doing fill-ins and things for Jim. And then at a certain point, Jim offered me a freelance contract there. And it was and at the same time, Len Wein wanted me to come on staff and be his assistant. So here I am, like brand new to the business, and suddenly I have this choice: full-time freelance contract at Marvel, Len's assistant. What an incredible thing. But what happened was my son was born right around the same time. And I realized I wanted to be home, so I could be there for my kid. So I had to say no to Len, and I said yes to Jim's contract. And that's when I first went over to Marvel.
Wow.
And I've been bouncing back and forth ever since. Yeah.
I think, was it the first ongoing series you had? Was that, if I'm not mistaken, writing the Defenders?
Even before that, the first monthly book they gave me was Conan.
Okay, yeah. So what was it like going from being a freelancer to getting, stories here and stories there to, okay, this is your book and you're writing it every month?
Right. It was a big deal. Plus, most of the stories I was doing at DC, even on the superhero stories I was doing, that was when they were doing a lot of those dollar books.
Yeah.
So stories were 10 or 12 pages, a lot of those stories. I had only written a handful of full-length stories. So suddenly, here you are. And then as I picked up other books, I'm doing 2 or 3 books a month, full-length stories. And at first I was like, holy Moses, how am I going to do this? But the biggest thing with Conan was that was right when Roy Thomas left the book.
Oh, man.
No, I'm a huge Conan fan. Roy Thomas is the guy that made Conan in comics,
Yeah.
I was so intimidated. I was terrified, and I stayed with the book, I don't know, maybe for a year, maybe not even a year. And I realized I loved Conan as a reader. I wasn't the guy to be writing Conan. It just didn't feel right. I think now I could revisit it and write it in a way that would satisfy me. But still, I got to work with John Buscema. I got to work with Gil Kane, these guys whose work I was like in awe of growing up. So that was great. And then the Defenders came along, and before you know it, I was doing Defenders and Marvel Team Up and Captain America and one thing after Ghost Rider, one thing after another. It was a busy time. It was a busy time.
And then in '85 you did the Moonshadow miniseries with John J. Muth for the Epic imprint, and that was the first fully painted
Yes.
series in American comics. So how did that come about? Like, how did you guys come up with the decision of, what we're gonna, this is all gonna be painted? Did you know at the time that was the first fully painted American comic?
I don't think we realized it at the time. What was going on in comics then? The 80s were a very exciting time. Everyone was sort of breaking barriers and trying new things. There were places like Pacific Comics, which were the first places where they were paying royalties and giving people copyrights. And then DC was doing things like Ronin and Camelot 3000, the first maxi series. And Marvel launched Epic and Epic Comics, and I was working on my Marvel stuff, and I was like, I want to step outside of this and do something like this stuff that I'm seeing around me, and do something that's my own. And Moonshadow was an idea that had been in the back of my head for years. In fact, one of the first samples that I sent to DC at the beginning was something called Stardust, which was a very, very primitive version of what Moonshadow would become. So I developed the Moonshadow idea. I pitched it to Jim Shooter. He said, "Oh, that's an epic comic." And I was just very lucky because I didn't have an artist in mind at the beginning. I'd spoken to a couple of people, and through my friend Dan Green, I met John J. Muth, and who was just, one of the most extraordinary artists I've ever worked with, one of the most brilliant creative minds I've ever worked with, and he was younger than I was. He was probably 22 when we were doing Moonshadow, and he was doing this extraordinary work. And the wonderful thing about that was by stepping out of kind of the Marvel DC, I am writing superhero comics mindset.
Yeah.
I just got to sit down and write as if I was writing a novel. And without realizing it, suddenly I found myself and I found my voice as a writer. It was one of the most important things I ever did working on Moonshadow. And it remains one of the single most important projects in my career. Dark Horse did a beautiful hardcover a couple of years ago. We're going to be putting out a paperback version of that next year.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah.
I'll definitely have to keep an eye out for that. But yeah, Marvel, like you said, you had runs on Captain America and Marvel Team Up, and you worked on like Doctor Strange, and you worked on Namor, you worked on all these characters. Was there a favorite among them that you had that maybe one book you enjoyed more than another, or just one that you were like, I can't believe I'm writing this character?
Well, when you grow up reading this stuff, you feel that way almost with every character you write, if you love them,
Yeah.
And, there's always that little 10 or 12-year-old in your head who's like, oh my God, I'm writing Spider-Man, and I was just saying to somebody the other day, that still is what keeps me going. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from a company that I shall not say about a character I cannot name.
Oh.
And, the same thing happened. It was like, yeah, I want to do that because the 10-year-old inside me is doing handsprings, what's interesting is sometimes, like I always loved Spider-Man, but writing Spider-Man, I found a connection to that character way beyond what the connection was as a reader. And obviously, Spider-Man has been a huge part of my career ever since. I just had past couple of years, I did the Ben Reilly miniseries, I did the Lost Hunt, and I'm working on the Spider-Man series as we speak. So it's a funny thing. Sometimes a character that you love as a reader, you go to write it, and maybe you're not connecting the way you had hoped, and another character comes alive. Same thing with Captain America. I always enjoyed Captain America as a reader, but writing that and getting to know Steve Rogers, and it's like getting to know a human being when you're writing these characters. You get to know them and their psyche and their thoughts and their feelings in a really, really intimate way, and they become your friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so Captain America is another one but Spider-Man has really, really, really stayed with me, and we keep going apart and coming back together, and it's like the same thing. It's like you haven't seen one of your really dear friends for 10 years, and you go out to lunch, and it's like no time has passed. Yeah. Every time I write a Spider-Man story, it's like that. Peter, how you doing? Ben, how are you? Oh, tell me what's up. And okay, let's go tell a story together.
Well, speaking of Spider-Man, in '87, you had worked with Mike Zeck on Captain America, which, as you could tell from my T-shirt, Captain America is my favorite character. I love that run that you had on it, and the artwork that Mike Zeck did on there, especially his covers, were just
his covers, man.
So
every one of those could be a poster.
Yeah, in fact, I actually have prints of a couple of them that I got from him autographed at Baltimore Comic-Con years ago that I have.
Yeah, I was going to say the prints that he's made of those things are just gorgeous. He's got Craven prints too that are just beautiful.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about. You teamed with him on Craven's Last Hunt, which is regarded, as one of, if not the best Spider-Man story ever, regarded as one of the best comic book stories ever. But I know I read that it started off as a pitch for a Wonder Man story, and then with him and Grim Reaper, and then that got rejected, and then it got turned into a Batman Joker story, which
got
rejected.
rejected. Then it was another Batman story, and that got rejected. I always say to people, stories have lives and timings of their own. There's my intention for the story, and then there's the story's intention. And sometimes the story needs time to find exactly the right way to express itself. That's what I felt like happened with Craven. I pitched this Wonder Man idea, and thank God Tom DeFalco said no.
What
Actually,
was the book it was going to be in?
It was a miniseries. It was going to be a miniseries, and it was the same premise, except, it was I love the emotional connections between characters. So these two brothers, one the hero, one the villain, and then the Grim Reaper was going to kill Wonder Man and bury him alive. The same premise was in there. That got thrown away, so I came up with this Batman pitch. Maybe a year later, I don't remember what year it was. I pitched it. I'm trying to think who I pitched it to first. It must have been Len Wein. And it was Batman and the Joker, and what I was proposing, I guess it was the early days of developing The Killing Joke, which didn't come out for a couple of years after that. But Len said, there are things in these two stories that are kind of similar, so this is not going to work for us. Okay, but I did, once again, I held on to that idea, and in the 90s, I did a story for Legends of the Dark Knight called Going Sane, Batman Going Sane, a really one of my favorite things I've ever done. So I took the germ of that one, held on to it, rewrote that. Meanwhile, a year goes by, and then I take the Joker out of the story, and I put in Hugo Strange, and I develop kind of a new twist on the story, where Hugo Strange puts on Batman's costume after he buries him alive and goes out to be Batman and prove that he's a better Batman than Batman. And this is how long ago it was. I remember Denny O'Neil read the pitch, liked it, and said, well, this is a graphic novel, and we've already done our one graphic novel for the year, our one Batman graphic novel. So I went, okay.
Now I went every week.
I know, exactly. Probably within a year after that, there was probably one every week.
Yeah.
And then I got invited to go back to Spider-Man. I had done Marvel Team Up for like 3 years and went on my merry way. And I thought, well, here's my chance again to try to do this story. So I developed the story, and I still had that Hugo Strange thing in my head. So I developed my own character who kind of played the same role that Hugo Strange had in the Batman story. Don't ask me who it was. It's been lost to the mists of time. I don't remember anything about the character. And
it wasn't someone that became a character.
No. But this is, again, where the story's will is stronger than my will. Because one day I'm sitting in my office, and I always say it was before the internet, so we had to find other ways to waste time instead of working. And I picked up a Marvel Universe handbook, and I just randomly flipped to Kraven the Hunter, character I never cared about, never thought about, meant nothing to me. And there was a little line in there that said that Kraven was Russian. And I am a huge Dostoevsky fan, and something clicked in my head, and I went, I understand this character. I know who he is. And I threw out the other villain, and in came Kraven. And then because Mike Zeck was going to draw it, in came Vermin, a character we created when we were doing Captain America. Peter had just gotten married. That really added to the emotional heft of the story. We had the black costume he was using at the time. I think the story would have read very different if he wasn't in the black costume.
Yeah.
The black costume fit that story. So all these elements came together at the exact right time. And the other element that came together at the exact time too was that I was in a horrible, horrible place in my life. I was wretched and miserable and struggling. I was Peter Parker in the grave, reaching Mary Jane, but all that got poured into the story. And I think that's one of the reasons, along with Mike's extraordinary artwork and storytelling, that story has lasted, because the emotions are really raw and unfiltered and true. That's what I was going through. Every character in that story, I realized years later, is like a piece of my psyche and representative of what I was struggling with at the time,
I think Kraven was a perfect character to use for it too, because, taking a character that already existed kind of gives it, a little bit more impact than having a character that you just created, because it's one of those things where, that end of it for him, I don't think would hit as hard if it was someone that the fans had just met a couple months before.
And that ending wasn't there until Craven came into the story. I always say, the story has its own will and the characters have their own will.
Mm-hmm.
And Craven led me to that ending. It's kind of the great hunter, that whole thing. And I remembered from when I was a kid hearing about Ernest Hemingway, the great hunter, killing himself, and I think that was the germ of what happened to Craven, but it was just it just led me there. I always say if the story surprises me, then I hope it'll surprise the reader, because that's what you hope for when you're writing, that something happens that you never planned on and the characters kind of rear up and surprise you, and that story was just like, I have no control over this story. It just came out.
Yeah.
And it was
like, sometimes you have it, I'll have stuff when I write that, kind of plot it out, but it's one thing to plot it out and have an outline, but then when you start writing, and especially when you start filling in dialogue and stuff, and you find that it's just moving away, then you have to make the decision, like, am I going to let it keep going this way, or am I going to stick with what I originally had, or I'm going to try and put them together?
I always say the stories, the characters, it's like you're on a horse, and you have a goal, and I'm going like 10 miles in that direction, and you start galloping, and then the horse starts pulling off in another direction, and no, I want to go here, and then the horse tries to pull off in another direction again, and you have a choice to force the horse to go that way or follow where the horse leads, and the horse is always right. When that happens, you have to follow where the story is leading you. You can't try to force this idea that you had, because the unconscious is where all the good stuff comes, and it's the unconscious that's leading you on. And that's my favorite part of writing, is when that happens, when this door opens in the back of my head and it's like, what is this? What is this movie I'm watching in my head? I didn't know that. Wow, this is great. And then you hope that you could get it down and do justice to what you're seeing in your head.
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing as a writer, at least when I'm coming up with stuff, is having that idea pop in my head and go like, oh, that's really cool. Like, and then the absolute next thought I have is, that's really cool. I hope this is something that I came up with and I'm not just remembering it from something I read 4 years ago.
Right. And, sometimes it happens all the time, because there's so much story out there. Even if it isn't something you read 100 years ago, you come up with this brilliant original idea, and the next day I open up, back in the day when you had physical newspapers, you open up Variety, and there's this movie they're talking about that it's the same idea. I just had this idea yesterday. And that's happened like the next day. And then there's a point you have to reach where it's like, okay, the ideas are similar, but I know that I can bring something specific and unique that's me to the table. And by the time I'm done, it will be something different, because the advantage we all have is we're unique individuals. And it's like I always imagine the story as like this light that's coming from the magical realm of story up there somewhere, shining through our unconscious and coming out of our eyes, but we've all got a different filter. A different color filter, and that's our experiences, that's our passions, that's our interests, that's our pain, that's all these things. So there's always something unique that's going to come out. If you and I sit and talk and plot out the same story, and you go home and write it, and I'll go home and write it, we're going to end up with two very different stories.
Yeah, I think it was a writing teacher I had once told me that, there's only 8 stories. I think that was the number he picked. Like, there's only 8 stories in the whole world. Your job as a writer is, you're not going to come up with anything brand new. Your job as a writer is to find a new and interesting way to tell the story that everybody already knows.
Yep. And that's the challenge with these characters that have been around for sometimes for like 80 years.
Yeah.
How do you do that? And for me, the answer is by going in. You got to dive into their heads. You got to root around in the shadows, take out your flashlight, and see if you can find some corner of that character's psyche that no one has shined a flashlight on before. Find something new to say, and yet you want it specific and new, and yet, it's a universal at the same time, so that we can all relate to it. But that's why I like to, for the 99% of the time, I'm writing the story from the inside out. Sometimes you have this like idea, what a cool plot, but even the coolest plot in the world doesn't matter if you don't have great characters that you connect to and identify with to lead you through that plot. If it's just, I've never been a fan of like these certain kind of mystery novels where the characters are really just kind of cardboard pieces, and what really carries you through is the twisting and twining of the plot. That's a great puzzle, and some people love that, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. But for me, it doesn't work. I want to get to the psychological and emotional meat of the characters in the story.
Yeah.
and let the plot grow around that.
And for Craven, I had read something too that originally your idea was you were just gonna have it take place in the pages of one book. I think it was Spectacular Spider-Man.
Yeah, Mike and I were hired for Spectacular Spider-Man, and Jim Salicrup came on as editor, and Jim very wisely said, you can't have Peter buried alive in Spectacular Spider-Man and fighting Dr. Octopus in Amazing Spider-Man, because it'll just fight the reality of the story.
Yeah.
And he was, as far as I know, he was the first guy in comics to do that thing where you take one story and run it through all the books for that single character. And that, like I said, all these elements came together to make that story powerful and unique. Not just my writing, not just Mike's art, but all the things that came together to make that happen.
Yeah. And I think that adds to the impact of it, but the longevity, what you said, if it's taking place in one book and there's just all this other stuff going on in other ones, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's the problem with some of these characters that have multiple books. Like, oh, well, I know Batman's not really dead in Justice.
Right.
When they just killed all the Justice League a few years ago, like, well, I know they're not dead because Superman's still got 2 books here. Batman's got a dozen books that come out a month.
Right.
This guy's got like, I know that, that kind of takes away from what the impact of the story could be.
Right. The fact that people got to the last page of the first part of Craven, and Spider-Man's in a coffin in the ground and they're throwing the dirt in, that was really shocking to people.
Yeah.
And because that was the only story being told, it didn't get watered down. Right. If the same month they were reading 2 other stories about Spider-Man, so what?
Yeah. Yeah. And especially with the tone of Spider-Man, where he's kind of a happy-go-lucky character. If they're, that's happening in one book, and the next book he's, bouncing around, having a good time, cracking jokes, Yeah, I think making it run through all 3 of the titles the way it did was great. And the again, Mike Zeck, like the covers that he did. I read that the one where he has Spider-Man coming out of the ground was the first, out of the grave was the first one that he did, and all the other ones flowed from that.
Right. Well, he said, that is the central image of the story, and it just, it jumped out at him the way Peter jumped out of the grave. Classic, beautiful cover. But all his covers are classic and beautiful. Mike is, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating. The great thing about when you work with an artist like Mike, and I have to give credit obviously to Bob McLeod for doing the great inking that he did as well, which really added texture and mood to the whole thing. But we were working what's called Marvel style, which means I wrote a very, very detailed plot, and then Mike penciled it. I would get the pencils back, and then I would do the final script. Well, when you have an artist like Mike, everything in your story is crystal clear. The panel-to-panel storytelling is impeccable. The emotions that you see on characters' faces and their reactions is impeccable. So that sometimes what you have to do, if the art doesn't do that, you have to over-explain things. You have to explain that thing that isn't clear in the art. The joke I always make is like, oh, I just tripped over a pipe on the roof and now I'm falling, because it wasn't clear in the artwork. So that's when you read comics sometimes and you'd see characters saying obvious things. It could be because the art did not achieve what the writer asked for, and they had to go back in and add that balloon or caption to clarify the art. But because Mike was so clear with the storytelling, so clear with the emotions, you read Craven, it's all interior monologue. So I was free to go into the characters' heads and go down to levels 2, 3, 4, and 5, and let the story be told through these interior monologues, instead of having to explain things. A different artist, I might have gotten that art back and the whole story would have read differently. But Mike freed me to really, really go deep.
And I'm glad you mentioned Bob McLeod. I actually did an interview with Bob McLeod about a month or 2 ago. And one of the last questions I asked him in it was, as an artist, like, hey, I'm sure you get a lot of commission requests, what's kind of some of the weird ones you've gotten? What's the coolest one you got? And he said the coolest one that he got, which he thought, man, that's a really great idea, is someone commissioned him to draw Kraven the Hunter, like kind of, if I remember what he said, right, like sitting in a chair. And then he has, where the hunters have like the heads mounted on the plaques behind them, but instead of it being animal heads, it was all superhero heads that were mounted behind them. And I was like, man, that does sound like it would have been a really cool looking piece.
Yeah, Bob's not just a great inker; he's a really wonderful, wonderful artist. He did a little backup Spider-Man story that was in one of our anniversary issues. It was just 5 pages, but he did such a beautiful job with it. It was just we spent like 5 pages with Aunt May remembering Uncle Ben's murder and all the emotions around that, and
Wow, right.
why she was terrified of Spider-Man because she identified him with Ben's murder, and
Hmm.
did such a story was called Thunder. I hope they reprint that one day because it was a great little story and all done in 5 pages.
Yeah. So yeah, working on Spider-Man on Craven's Last Hunt is, as lighthearted as of a character as Spider-Man can be, that was, a darker story. And then, like you said, you bounced between Marvel and DC. And one of the books you wrote at DC was you took over the Justice League series right when they were getting it to end. And I remember reading something where you said, they asked you to take over Justice League, but you're like, this isn't the Justice League I remember. And they had you come on at the end of the series. We're like, well, you need to kill off all of these characters.
Yeah, because Jerry Conway had left the book, and they were wrapping the book up because they were doing I guess it was the Legends series, and
Yeah.
then they were going to spin this new Justice League out of that, which I knew nothing about and had no clue I was going to spend the next 5 years after that working on, and so I wrote those stories. I believe Luke McDonnell was the artist on that. Andy Helfer was the editor. And they said, kill so and so and so. So I killed off the characters, and it was actually the last storyline. It was maybe a 6-part story. It was a solid story, but it wasn't the Justice League that I grew up with. It wasn't Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern. And I thought I was done with Justice League. And then Andy called me up one day and said, well, Keith Giffen was taking over Justice League. He's going to plot it. He was going to write it. He decided he wasn't comfortable yet doing the full writing, so he's just going to plot it. We need somebody to come on and do the dialogue. And I looked at what Keith had done. I said, you don't need me. This is great. Keith is great. You don't need me. I fought with them for months. You know what I mean? You don't need me. You don't need me. Until I was finally wised up and went, what a great gig this is. I'm having so much fun. And then the next thing I knew, it was 5 years later, and it was Justice League Europe, Justice League Quarterly. I was doing spin-offs of Mr. Miracle and Dr. Fate and Martian Man. I mean, it was just, it consumed my creative life for 5 years. And it also began a lifelong relationship and creative partnership with Keith.
Yeah, and I know you worked with him a lot. One thing I wanted to ask about, the Justice League series before that was, I read that when you wrote the first issue of it, you used the pen name Michael Ellis.
Oh no! Well, that wasn't on Justice League. That was on that was on the previous. That was
on the
previous one. That was just a dumb thing on my part. I had just finished Moonshadow, and I was like, I don't know if I want to write superheroes anymore, dummy. You know what I mean? Little within a month or two, I was probably writing Craven's Last Hunt after that. But I forget what it was. And I was just like, I don't know if I want to write superheroes anymore. And I was over Jerry Conway's plot, and I was like, I'm going to use a pen name, and then I'll figure out. It was just a momentary misfiring of my brain, really.
Yeah.
And then Paul Levitz came in and said, no pen names. We're using your name. And the next issue, we use my name, and it was fine. It was a momentary glitch in the matrix. So, Michael Ellis was a name that I had used on the last issue of my Captain America run, because I had plotted a very specific double-sized anniversary issue, and editorial heads way up the food chain came down and said, you can't do that story. They cut it in half. They changed it. So I took my name off. And Mark Gruenwald was the one who suggested the name Michael Ellis, because it was from a Monty Python skit. He was a guy that people kept talking about, but he never showed up. So we thought that was a great name. So that's why I used that in that Justice League story as well. So Michael Ellis only has 2 appearances, once in Captain America and once in Justice League.
So what you had said too was Keith Giffen on Justice League was plotting it, and you were doing the dialogue. So you guys had that long run on there. Was it always like that, where he would do the plots and you would do the dialogue, or at some point did you guys kind of start switching roles, or did you kind of both have a hand in it, or was it always?
It basically stayed that way, at least certainly for those first 5 years of Justice League. But here's the thing. Here's the way it worked. Keith would do a plot, but Keith being Keith, and Andy as well, gave me total freedom to do with that plot as I wanted to. And through the dialogue, you can add subplots that weren't there. You can add character bits that weren't there. You can develop characters in a way that's not in the plot. And Keith never once said, you can't do that to my plot. Certain people, I've had the experience where they give you their plot, and I'm the dialogue guy, and what they want is for you to follow their plot exactly. Keith wasn't like that. So I had freedom to kind of spin the plates. And then Keith would go, oh, that's really cool. I like what you did there. And he would develop it there. Then I'd see what he did and I'd build on that. And I always said it was like a game of tennis, back and forth and back and forth. And even if sometimes we talked about the plots and Keith said, I'm going to do this. I said, why don't you do that? And then he'll go off and do whatever the hell he wanted anyway and change it. But that was the great thing about our collaboration. And as we continued to work together over the years, we would talk about the stories more. But I always knew Keith's going to go off and do whatever he wants with the plot. And he's going to let me do whatever I want with the dialogue. And that was the fun of the collaboration.
And the artist you guys had on that, Kevin McGuire, I mean, his artwork just, sometimes you get those books where the art and the writing don't quite fit together, but like his artwork with what you guys were doing with the writing was just absolutely spot on.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was saying before with Craven, all the elements have to come together to make something work. And Kevin was really an unknown commodity. It was Andy's genius. How he thought to put me and Keith together, first of all. I don't know how that happened. And then to look at Kevin and know this is the guy that can do this. Because I always say, if someone other than Kevin McGuire had drawn those stories, we might not be talking about them today. Kevin was the absolute right guy at the absolute right time to bring to illustrate a story that depended so much on character interaction and reaction.
Especially the facial expressions that you would do.
Nobody does it better.
That was what made it.
Nobody does it better than Kevin. Nobody.
Yeah, it kind of made me think of John Belushi was such a great comedic actor, but you could put him on put a camera on him for a minute and not have him say a word and have him just go through different facial expressions, and he would have you just cracking up laughing. And that's kind of what Kevin McGuire's artwork reminded me of when he would do the facial expressions on the characters, because his action stuff was great, but he had that right kind of comic sensibility to go with it too.
Yeah, nobody does acting on the page better than Kevin. Just fantastic.
And when you guys did the Justice League, did you know Keith Giffen before you started that book together?
Keith and I met because I think even before we started Justice League, we did a Dr. Fate miniseries together that actually came out a few months after Justice League, but we started working on it before Justice League. That was one of the few times I worked with Keith where I was the writer and he was the artist. But even when Keith was the artist, he's always throwing things in, throwing in story elements and plot elements, because it's just who he is, because he was brilliant, And so we knew each other a little bit from working on the Dr. Fate thing. And then once we were thrown together on Justice League, it was 5 years of a lot of work together. And then we didn't work together again for 10 years. And then we did formerly known as the Justice League, me, Keith, and Kevin. And that was the moment when the three idiots went, oh, I think this is pretty good what we do together. We had no clue, because however good Justice League, our original run, might have been, it was just a gig to us. It was a fun gig. But it was just another job. And when the job is over, you move on to the next job. You're not looking back and thinking about, oh, that was great, or that was it. You just move on. Yeah. But when we got back together for formerly known as the Justice League, I remember thinking, we're going to try to recapture this. It's going to be like one of those bad TV movies, where Return to Mayberry, or, Mary and Rhoda, or whatever all those terrible, terrible TV movies where they try to take a show and bring it back again. And I remember within like 3 pages, something clicked again. It was like, oh my God, I am having so much fun. And we ended up winning an Eisner for that one. And then we did I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League. And we revisited it several times after that. And not to mention all the other things that Keith and I have done together. And then with Kevin, we did Metal Men and we did Defenders. Excuse me. Keith and I continued to work together right through Scooby Apocalypse, which I think ended in 2019.
Yeah, and I love that formerly known as Justice League series. When that came out, I was really excited for that, and I absolutely loved that book. I mean, you can see that's one of the ones up behind me here. When you guys did the Justice League book, like, that was such a departure from what had been done previously with them, because Justice League is kind of one of the main flagship DC books. Was there any kind of pushback from them on it having such a comedic tone to it, or was that something they weren't, or was that something that DC wanted for it?
No, two things I'll say about that. One is in terms of pushback, we never had to deal with that.
Hmm.
Andy, our editor, was the guy. He would take all the bullets. He just wanted us off creating, and he dealt with all the office politics. A lot of the editors there did not want their characters in our book because they thought we were going to make fun of their characters. Well, we never made fun of the characters. We had fun with the characters, which is a very different thing. You know, and Denny O'Neil, God bless him, gave us Batman and said, "Go with God." But and in terms of the tone, we didn't set out to do a comedy book.
Hmm.
It just sort of naturally evolved. No one said at the beginning of that, a new approach to superheroes. We're going to do a lighthearted sitcom. No, never happened. Keith being Keith, there's always some humor in his work. I picked up on that, and me being who I am, I'm going to take that little joke that Keith has and repeat it 100 times, and turn it into a running gag and beat it into the ground. That's how Bwahaha started. Neither Keith nor I could know who created it.
Yeah.
He thinks that I did it first, and he picked up on it. I think I saw it in a plot and went, "That's great. I'm going to use that 100 times now. And every time someone laughs, we're going to go." So one of us beat it into the ground, and we don't know which one it is, and we don't want to know, because the fun of it was that it just sort of evolved naturally. But we did not set out to do a comedy book. But as it went along, same thing. The characters kind of led us. Suddenly, Beetle and Booster are in a room, and they're talking to each other, and they're both funny.
Yeah. I mean,
And
that's an iconic, that's an iconic partnership that's lasted for decades since then.
yes, yeah. And we didn't plan it. It just happened. It happened. It combusted on the page.
And then, one of the most iconic moments from that book that, always gets referenced back is the Batman Guy Gardner, the one punch, and then Blue Beetle in the background going, "One punch."
Right. I give most of the credit for that to Keith, because that came out of his head. All I had to do was throw in some dialogue, and of course Kevin drew it perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's the funny thing. It's like, wait a minute, it's all these years later, and people are still talking about one punch. Or Bwahaha. Keith and I used to joke. It's like, well, at the end of our lives, the only thing people are going to remember is Bwahaha. Nothing else. But it's a great thing that years go by and people keep same thing with Craven. People keep they're discovering the book for the first time. New readers keep coming along. There's another, our final Justice League Omnibus is coming out, I think, in February.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have Formerly Known, and I Can't Believe, and all these other things in there. And it's great. They keep reprinting the work. People keep discovering it. You couldn't ask for anything more.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed on that book too is it started off as Justice League, and then it was Justice League International. And then a little while goes by, and it was Justice League America. Was that changing the name of it like that? Was that something that you guys came up with, or was that?
Yeah, that was what I remember. Was it was a natural evolution, because it was an international team.
Mm-hmm.
I think whether it was Andy or Keith, someone decided, well, let's brand it as that. But then we split off into Justice League Europe. So so one of the books had to be Justice League America to separate it from Justice League Europe. It was just a natural evolution. We didn't plan very much on that book. It was all very spontaneous. We kind of stumbled into it.
Well, I think it was lightning in a bottle, because it's just, I mean, when I go back and read old comics, that series is one that's just always so much fun to go back and read.
Yeah, every once in a while I'll pull one off the shelf and look at it, and I'll laugh because I don't remember the stories.
Yeah,
and I'll be laughing, and I realize, well, if I'm laughing, it must be pretty good.
And like you said, you've jumped back and forth between DC and Marvel a lot, and then the '90s you went back to Marvel and you were working on Spider-Man again, and you did that story where Harry Osborn, the Harry Osborn Green Goblin, came back in Spectacular Spider-Man, and you had him brought him back as that, had him battling Spider-Man, and eventually he died at the end of that story. So what was it like doing that story, compared to some of the other stuff that you've done?
Though that's some of my favorite stuff I've ever done. First of all, working with Sal Buscema was a dream. Sal, no matter how much he's appreciated, he's still underappreciated.
Yeah.
Extraordinary storyteller. He can draw really, really well. He'll give you the big action. He'll give you the emotions. And again, we keep talking about chemistry. It's either there or it's not. And Sal and I we just clicked. First panel, first page. I remember thinking, this is great, and off we went. We sparked each other. And those stories, that Harry Osborn thing ran through about 2 years of that book, Harry, we had the child within, then Harry would disappear, then he'd come back, then he'd disappear, then he came back for the big final thing where he died. And those are just some of my favorite stories that I've ever done. The child within, that first 7, we started with a 7-parter with the child within, which is one of my all-time favorite things that I've ever done. And it's one of my, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, it's one of my great frustrations that stuff has never been collected. It's been collected in Poland, in Italy, in South America, been collected all over the world. It's never been collected in the United States. I would love to see a nice omnibus edition of that whole run.
Yeah, that would be great. I definitely remember one of those covers, and granted it was, the 90s gimmick covers that they did, which, are kind of coming back now, but it was that one with Spider-Man fighting Green Goblin on the cover, and it was that silver kind of foil background.
Right, that was Spec 200, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember picking that up off the shelf and being like, oh man, that's so cool.
Yeah, that cover, some of those covers worked and some didn't. That one really worked.
Yeah, that one was really cool. And then after you did that, another big Spider-Man storyline was Maximum Carnage. What was it like working on that when that was a book that was so many parts and it ran, through so many different titles, but unlike when you did Craven running through the 3 books, like it was all different creative teams. Like how how much input did everybody have coming up with that, and how hard was it to keep track of it with all those different hands in the pot?
Well, it's the same issue that we had when we were doing the Clone Saga a few years later. You have a lot of cooks and one big pot. I remember with Maximum Carnage, we had a big meeting in Manhattan. All the writers, all the artists came together. They locked us away for like three days with Danny Fingeroth and the whole team, and we put that story together. And I have to be honest, Maximum Carnage, I'm a little conflicted about. There are elements of that story that I really, really like, and elements of that story that were a bit much. We were trying in a lot of ways to address the excesses of 90s comics through that story and the ultra-violent characters. But I think when you spend so much time with those ultra-violent characters, it kind of throws the balance of the story off. I was never a big fan of Venom or Carnage, to be perfectly honest. Again, though, there are some great moments there, and I'll talk about Sal. One of my favorite moments ever with Sal, there's a sequence somewhere in the middle of the story where there's this big battle going on in Central Park. Spider-Man gets the crap beat out of him, and he's literally, like, it's not a 9-panel grid, Spider-Man crawling through the dirt, and in the last panel you see these boots, and you turn the page to this beautiful Sal Buscema spread, 2-page spread of Captain America reaching out, and it was like, Sal's one of the great Captain America artists as well, and it was like, that double-page spread alone made the whole thing worthwhile. But some of the problems that you run into, and I've worked on these kind of things before, where you have multiple writers. So when the Clone Saga, we'd all sit in a room and we had a great time. The guys that worked on Spider-Man were just a fantastic, the editors, the other writers, we liked each other, we respected each other. They'd lock us away for hours. We'd laugh, we'd insult each other, we'd eat pizza, we'd have a great time, But you work out a story, and just what we were talking about before, like if you and I work on a story, we both go off and write it, it's a very different story. So you sit in a room and you work out this 4-part story, then everybody goes off to write their chapter, and you see so-and-so's chapter, and you're like, that's not the way I saw it. You have all these different voices that are fighting to come together to be one complete story. And sometimes I think the different voices conflict. Or the other thing is it gets in the way of spontaneity. I'm a very spontaneous writer. And a couple of times usually was ending up with the Clone Saga with chapter 3. And DeFalco was a dear friend of mine, would write chapter 4. And I remember one time in particular, at the end of the story, I had this whole revelation about this character that I wasn't in anything that we discussed. And I threw it in, not knowing Tom had already started writing part 4. So after he saw what I did at the end of part 3, he had to go back and change the beginning of part 4. And one of the main reasons that I left the Spider books at that point was like, I was just tired of writing chapter 3.
Yeah.
But there was, again, same thing with the Clone Saga. There's a lot of controversy around it, but a lot of great characters, a lot of great stories. And a lot of those characters have come back over the years. Kane was a great character. Ben Reilly is I love Ben Reilly, one of my favorite Marvel characters of all time. There was so they spent a few years kind of trying to sweep the Clone Saga away, but I was happy to see it all kind of come back. It's kind of like what DC did with Justice League. Those few years in the early 2000s where like Max shoots Beetle in the head, and everything they could do to sort of undo everything that we did, and then slowly it all came back, because that's the truth of comics.
Yeah.
It all always comes back one way or the other. You don't like the big change they're doing on Monday, wait till Wednesday, they'll do something else.
Yeah, I remember there used to be a saying about comics, that I would hear a lot. They'd say, nobody stays dead in comics except for Uncle Ben and Bucky, and then they brought Bucky back.
Right,
So,
right,
all right, well,
exactly.
that's out the window.
Wait till you see the next Spider-Man villain, he pulls off its mask and it's Uncle Ben. No, I don't think they'll ever do that. That would be a horrible thing to do.
They so yeah, you mentioned the Clone Saga. Like, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, it was supposed to be a very short, finite storyline, and it was going to be Peter and MJ kind of going off and and having their happily ever after, and then Ben, like, oh, the clone, and he survived, and now he's Spider-Man again, and Peter and Mary Jane are off on their own.
The idea was that it would turn out that Ben was actually the real Peter.
Yeah.
And Peter and Mary Jane would go off and have their happily ever after, but he was still there. He was Spider-Man. You could pull him in anytime you want. So now you have two characters, kind of like what they did years later, with Miles Morales, and now with the Spider-Verse, where they 100 times over,
Yeah.
So we thought this was a great idea, because everyone's always like, oh, he's married, he's this, he's that, we need a younger Spider-Man. So here you had them both. You had the married Peter, they were going to go off and have their baby, and then you had Ben coming back to start over. And the plan was to restart all the books with Ben as Spider-Man. We're going to have a new supporting cast, new villains. We were really going to do this whole fresh start. And on one level, we were the victims of our own success, because what happened was the books were selling really well. And our plan was, let's do it in 6 months, or at most a year, and this would be over. Because it was going through 4 books. That's a lot of story.
Yeah.
And the marketing department kept saying, more. I don't know. It went on for what, 2 years? I don't know how long it went on. It went on a long time. At a certain point, I put on my parachute and jumped out of the plane, because I was kind of done with it. But again, some of the stories, I think were fantastic stories. Everybody worked their asses off on those books. Great group of writers. And I got to do the Lost Years, that Ben Reilly miniseries, one of my favorite things I've ever done. Death of Aunt May, one of my favorite things I've ever done. And like I said, Ben came back. Kane came back. Eventually, they all came back, and they found their place in the universe.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that could, if they had stuck with the original idea that you guys had done, that could have been up there with one of the best Spidey stories of all time.
But I think so. Yeah, if we had done it in 6 or 8 months and been out and done, and then had this whole new launch, and plus you could do a Peter series if you want to.
Yeah.
And the other thing we were going to do, because I did the Lost Years mini, that was supposed to be the first of many stories exploring Ben's 5 years on the road. But all that's really been done, I did another one with Mike Zeck called Redemption, which was about Ben, and then I did the Ben Reilly series last year. But we, 5 years expanded into comic book time. That's 20 years worth of stories.
Yeah,
I could have had an ongoing Ben Reilly series set during those 5 years, but it never happened.
And I know years later, was in 2009, they released it was a 6-issue miniseries, the Spider-Man Clone Saga, that Howard Mackie and Tom DeFalco and Tom did, that was supposed to be like, hey, here's what the Clone Saga was supposed to be. Did you consult on that at all, or did you see that when it came out?
No, I did not read it, but I'm sure it was great, because both those guys are great. But that was what they remember. I think one of them had some notes, but it doesn't mean that's what it was going to, way it was going to end up. If we had done it then in real time in that way, I think they probably hit the big beats. But stories change, and then again, you have an idea, then you execute it, it becomes something else entirely. Every month, it became something else entirely. So to look back 25 years later and say this is the way it was going to be, it was, I think what it was a fun experiment, a nice little what if.
Yeah, and if you can remember, do you know at what point it was when you guys were doing the original storyline that you felt like, okay, this, we've jumped the shark, or we've gone off the rails here, like we're too far away from what we intended? Like, was there any one moment that really made you realize that, or was it just something that you kind of came to the realization over time?
Yeah, I think it was more the latter. I remember being a little iffy about a storyline that we did called Maximum Clonage, where there were like just a million clones running around for a
Mhm.
while. Um, but I think it was more in the end, it was because the story kept getting dragged out.
Yeah.
Had it been done concisely, just as you said, I think it would be a classic. And here's the other truth, though. You know how it is, the stories that you read it when you're 12 are your favorite stories. So it was reviled for a time, and then all those 12-year-olds grew up,
Yeah.
and it's their favorite story.
Hmm.
You know, the editor that I work with at Marvel now on Spider-Man, Danny Chasm, look, he loves he knows more about those stories than I do, and I wrote them. You know, and that's his favorite period of Spider-Man because those were the stories that imprinted on him. So you know, it's all cyclical, and the story that everybody hates on Monday, somebody, you know, they all love on Friday. So you can't get too attached to results because you never know where it's going to end up.
And you talked a lot about Ben Riley. How do you think, or what do you think about how Marvel has handled the character in the years since, where he kind of went off on his own and went through some things, and now he's, you know, in the past year or so has become a villain. I think where they call him Chasm. Like, what are your thoughts on what they've done with the characters?
Yeah, I haven't read those stories, so I can't really comment on them, you
Mhm.
know. And all these stories, all these characters go through permutations. Ben has been through he's been dead and back and dead and back, and you know, all I know is he's a great character. I love that character, and I think he will
Yeah,
have a very, very long life, one way or the other. I loved working on that Ben Riley Spider-Man series last year or whatever it was. It was such a pleasure to get to know that character again and fill in the blank in that part of his history. You know, these characters become very, very real to you. They become
yeah.
your friends, and it was a real joy to get reacquainted with that character.
And you know, working on Spider-Man a lot, and then also working between Marvel and DC. One, you know, one or I guess two books that you did, which I mean were great when Marvel and DC used to get along enough with each other to do these, was when you did the Spider-Man Batman crossover, and you did the first one with Mark Bagley. I'm unfortunately
Yep,
I can't remember who did the art on the second one, but
it was. Oh, now that you've said that, it's, oh God, I'm really, really embarrassed. Graham Nolan.
yes, yes.
Graham Nolan. Phew,
So what
glad I
was it like
remembered.
working on those? But like, I guess more specifically, you know, the first one where it's, you know, these two, you know, two of the most iconic characters that each company has, and like, hey, we're going to cross them over, and you're going to write it. What was that like?
It's, you know, it's great. Again, there's a little 10-year-old in your soul, you know, when you and you love these characters. And a little 10-year-old inside me is like, Spider-Man and Batman, I can't
Yeah.
believe I get to do this, you know. That, you know, if that joy leaves you, it's time to leave the business.
Hmm.
Happily, it has never left me. So that was just, it was great. It was tremendous amount of fun. Bagley did a beautiful, beautiful job with it. You know, they basically told us, you know, use Carnage and use the Joker. So that was dictated to us. But then the trick is to create a story that has some depth and some meaning for me. And
Yeah.
I think we did. And then whatever it was, a year and a half later, I get a call from DC saying, well, no, we're doing Batman and Spider-Man. Do you want to do it? So I got to do it twice.
Yeah.
And that was Kingpin and Ra's al Ghul. I mean, that was so much fun. And
Yeah.
looking, it's more astonishing to me in retrospect. Again, at the time, it's you get offered a job, you do the job. Now I look back and say, I got to do Batman, Spider-Man, and I got to do it twice, one for each company. What a cool thing! What a
Yeah.
really cool thing.
I really wish that Marvel and DC got along well enough now that they could do some of these crossovers again, because they were always, you know, even the worst ones were really cool and really fun.
Yeah, yeah, it's just fun to mix those universes up. Yeah, I'd love to see them do that again. I bet you at some point they will.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, because, you know, when you're a kid, you know, I think a lot of us got into comics as a kid. You know, you're sitting there like, I've got my Batman superpowers figure and I've got my Spider-Man Secret Wars figure, and you don't care that they're in different universes. You're like, oh, yeah. And, you know, and it's the, you know, the lifelong question with fans. Oh, who'd win in a fight, this character or this character?
Yeah, exactly,
I
exactly.
whenever those come up, my answer is I always go, you know, who'd win in the fight? Whoever the writer wants to win.
Exactly, exactly. People forget that you know, we do have the power to make it end however we'd like.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and the fun thing also, you know, while I'm working on all these iconic characters, I'm always working on some creator-owned book. I was writing for Vertigo, I was writing for Epic, you know, Piranha Press, whatever. So I always try to keep a balance going, you know, but I'm all right, I'm doing the superheroes, I'm doing creator-owned stuff, I'm doing some kid-friendly stuff. The stuff with Giffen was like in its own universe. I always said that, you know, that's our own specific universe, has nothing to do with the rest of the DC universe. So, and plus I'd be working in animation, I'd be working in movies. It's really important as a creative person to keep as many doors open as you possibly can. Because creatively, it always keeps you interested. If all I had done was just superhero comics, I think I would have burned out at a certain point. But and the other thing is you want to keep those doors open because as a freelancer, the first lesson is those doors close. So if that door closes, thank God that door is open. I can go over there. And when that door slams in my face, I can go in that door over there. So you always have to be working all sides of the street.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Vertigo. When you were at DC, and you were one of the first ones that helped launch the Vertigo imprint with
Yeah.
some of the graphic novels and miniseries. So what was it like, being one of the first ones to launch this imprint? How do you get involved with that?
Well, I did Moonshadow and Blood for Epic, which was sort of like, in a lot of ways, a foundation for what Vertigo built on later. But Karen Berger is one of my oldest and dearest friends. I was the one that introduced her to Paul Levitz and got her into the business, and then she went on and built this extraordinary career for herself. And so, I've been working with Karen before that, obviously. And then I was there as she was developing Vertigo. I remember getting on the phone with her and she was bouncing, oh, I have this name. What about this? What do you think of Vertigo? Vertigo, that's a good name, So I was very, very involved from the very beginning. But how I got involved with the launch was, and this is one of those obscure stories, Art Young had been Karen's assistant at DC. He got pulled into Disney Publishing, and they wanted to launch an adult reader's line, kind of like the work that he and Karen had been doing at DC. There was no Vertigo yet. So it was me, Grant Morrison, a whole lot of other people that had worked on Karen's books. And I was working with Paul Johnson on a graphic novel called Mercy. And what happened was one morning, I guess someone at Disney woke up and went, we're Disney. We can't do these kind of comics, Right when Karen's about to launch Vertigo, and now Art's got all these books by all these, creators that have worked with Karen anyway. So all our books went over to Vertigo.
Nice.
And so we all became part of the launch there. So I did Mercy. I did the last one. We did the Moonshadow sequel, Farewell Moonshadow. I did Seekers into the Mystery. I was very involved in those early years of Vertigo.
Another thing you had done for DC, it's a character that, could have easily been a Vertigo book, but, for, whatever reason, always was kind of core DC was the Spectre, but you wrote him when it was Hal Jordan as the Spectre. So what was that like, taking this, this character and Hal Jordan that was one of the first Silver Age characters, been this iconic, main DC character, part of the Justice League and the Green Lantern Corps and all this stuff, and now you're writing him in this way that's completely different than anything that's been done with him. And then kind of the same thing for the Spectre too, because he's merged with with Hal Jordan instead of someone else. What was it like working on that book?
Well, as a kid growing up, Green Lantern was one of my favorite characters. I love Green. It's just a wonderful premise. It's basically, will plus imagination create anything you want. It's not just a great premise for a comic book. It's a great premise for your life, bring your will to bear on your imagination and make it the life that you want it to be. So I loved Green Lantern. So when they first offered it to me and they said, this is what's going on, Hal Jordan is the Spectre, my first reaction was, what? What the hell? How am I going to wrap my head around that? And my second reaction was, I can't do the Vengeance Spectre. Remember those old stories where he would turn into a giant cheese grater and grate the bad guy, So I said, it has to be a story about Hal's redemption. And they said, that's exactly what we want. So I think I worked on that for 3 years. We did a 4-parter in Legends of the DC Universe, and I did an issue of Justice League that kind of reintroduced him there. And then we did at least 2.5 years of the ongoing series. First, Ryan Sook was the main artist, and then Norm Brayfogle, 2 incredible artists. What better collaborators could you ask for? And that, every once in a while, you with a mainstream book, you stumble upon a book that it's almost like a creator-owned book because you have the freedom to tell very unique stories in your own unique way. That happened with me a few years before that when I did Dr. Fate at DC. That might as well have been a creator-owned book. They let me do it however I wanted to do it. And Spectre, in my mind, was sort of like an unofficial sequel to Dr. Fate. They were very spiritual stories. I got to explore, all the things I love with metaphysics. And I had a great time on that run, a really, really fantastic time. And another one, when the book came out, it was like there were all these Hal Jordan fans were like, I don't want Hal Jordan to be the Spectre. I want him to be Green Lantern. And there are all these Spectre fans that are like, I don't want Hal Jordan to be the Spectre. I want that old Spectre back, you know?
Yeah.
So I remember when it was coming out, a lot of negativity coming at that book. And I'm like, I'm having a great time working with these great artists, writing what I think are really excellent stories. And then again, time passed, and suddenly you're at a convention and someone comes up and said, God, this series meant the world to me. It was some of my favorite comics in it. But sometimes it takes a few years for these things to ripple out, you know, or the ones that are so vocal about hating something do not reflect the mass of the audience that's reading it and taking it into their hearts, you know. So Spectre, I would love to see them collect all that stuff, you know, starting with the Legends of the DC Universe right through the whole Spectre series and put that out. It'd be great.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like the people that have the most negative stuff to say are the ones that, have the loudest voice, because the people that enjoy it, they're not going on there, too often saying how great it is. They're just sitting there they're just sitting there enjoying
Right,
it.
enjoying it. Exactly. And now with social media, that megaphone has gotten even bigger and louder. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that DC came to you with that and said, we want you to do the Spectre and it's going to be this. How often does that happen? Like you said earlier, when you and Giffen and McGuire went back to do the Justice League, the formerly known as the Justice League, was that something that DC came to you and said, hey, we want you to do this? Or was it something that the three of you got together and said, hey, why don't we do this? Let's come up with an idea and take it to DC and see.
There had been talk several times about doing the three of us getting together. At one point with Andy, we were going to do the last Justice League story where there was like years had passed and they were older, and it was going to be the final story. And we all got pumped up about it, and someone at DC for whatever reason pulled the plug.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dan Raspler, who was my editor on the Spectre, he must have been talking to Keith, so maybe Keith suggested it. I don't remember. So I don't know whether it came from Keith or came from DC, and they called me up, or Keith called me up and said, do you want to do this? Sure, I'll work with you guys again. Why wouldn't I want to work with those guys?
Yeah.
And then they let us do it however we wanted to do it. And I have to say, in the years between the first run and the second run, there's probably even twice as much dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue in those early stories. When you get to formerly known as, you see there's even more dialogue going on. We just had a blast. But and I see these days more often than not, it used to be, for the most part, from the creator up, meaning, hey, I've got this great idea for Spider-Man. Let's do this. Oh, that's great. Go do that. Now, more often than not, what you get is a phone call where they say, this is what we want to do. And they present a framework, and then you say yes or no to that. Now, the trick is to still make it incredibly personal and find your vision for that story. Because as we said, that framework is just a framework, and it could be told 1,000 different ways. But definitely it's gotten more Hollywood. I don't know, where it's like, it's coming from the top down as opposed to from the bottom up. But in the end, it's up to the writer and the artist to make it uniquely theirs.
Yeah. I mean, I think we see that now, especially with how predominant the TV shows and the movies based on comics are, which, as a comics fan, it's great that, you're getting to see this stuff. But on the other side of it, I tend to notice too, like, all right, whatever they're doing in the movies, they're going to do something in the comics to mirror that. Like, they just introduced this new character in Marvel that's the new Punisher, and I was telling people, like, well, Frank Castle's going to be in the Daredevil show whenever that comes back. So they're going to bring him back because he's going to be on the, on the TV show. So
right.
Maybe that has something to do with it too. Like, they always want to have something in the comics, to mirror what's going on in the other stuff.
Right. Exactly. I think one of the reasons we did Lost Hunt was because they knew the Kraven movie was coming.
Mm-hmm.
And, at first they called me up and said, we want to do something that involves Kraven. And I was like, my first reaction, honestly, was, Kraven again. But then this is what you have to do. I found my way into the story. I came up with this new character who had been pivotal in Kraven's evolution from, this broken Russian refugee to the hunter. And that opened the door onto a story that I really, really got excited about and I'm very proud of. But you have to find that way in. Like I said, my first reaction was like, I don't know. And then a light bulb goes off and all of a sudden you're excited and you're ready to go.
Mm-hmm. And as I say, with you and Giffen and DeMatteis working on Justice League, and then you had mentioned earlier too that you guys did the Defenders series for Marvel that was at. So was that something that you all pitched to Marvel, or was it Marvel that came to you and said, "Hey, we want to do this"? And
when I worked with Keith, a lot of the time the way it worked was I'm off doing my own thing, and the phone rings and it'd be Keith going, "You want to do it?" Blah blah blah. Oh, it's Keith. Yeah, of course I'll do it. I always said, and I meant it. If Keith called me up and said, "Let's do Millie the model," I would have said yes, because the joy for me was working with Keith.
Mm-hmm.
And then, when DC had this idea to do, when they were doing the Hanna-Barbera books, and they went to Keith, and Keith came to me and he said, "We're going to do this Scooby-Doo book." My first reaction was, "What? What are you talking about?" But it was Keith. So I said yes. And it turned out to be one of my favorite gigs. And we did it for like 3 years. So I forgot what your original question was. Oh, Defenders. Yeah.
The Defenders one.
Yeah. So I think it probably started with Keith. But it's funny because both Keith and I started our careers at Marvel at different times on Defenders. Mm-hmm. Defenders was one of my first books at Marvel. And Defenders was the first book that Keith ever drew at Marvel. So it was kind of a nice thing. And of course, we had Kevin along to make it look just perfect.
Yeah, one of the shows that we do on the podcast here is we do one called Comic Character of the Week, and then each week we pick a different character and we kind of do a deep dive on, and we talk about what we like and don't like, and best covers and best stories and that. And a few weeks ago we did one on Doctor Strange, and that Defender series was one of the ones I picked as my top 3 Doctor Strange stories, because I loved how you guys wrote Strange in that.
Yeah, Doctor Strange is one of my all-time favorite characters, and in fact, one of my favorite things also that I've ever done was a graphic novel that I did with Dan Green, who, like Keith, passed away recently, called Into Shambhala. I think one of the best things I've ever done, really and I would love, again, I don't know why Marvel has never reprinted it. Every time a Doctor Strange movie came out, I thought, now they're going to reprint Into Shambhala. In fact, in the first movie, a lot of the visuals were lifted from Dan's visuals. They had a little joke about Shambhala. It was the Wi-Fi password, if you remember. The director kept talking about Into Shambhala. The Cumberbatch talked about Into Shambhala. And they're going to reprint it. They never reprinted it. So I'm hoping that one of these days, before we all get too old, they will reprint these things.
I miss when Marvel did those original graphic novels.
Yeah,
DC's kind of does something similar with the Black Label stuff now. Though they don't do it as the one shots, they do it as the mini series. But I miss Marvel doing that. I think that's something that
they were great. I did a couple of those, yeah. And the Shambhala, and I guess it was 2019 in Italy, they did a beautiful oversized hardcover that I have over here on a shelf. They did such a beautiful job with it. I would love to see Marvel do something like that, because that art, Dan's painted art, is just extraordinary.
Yeah, that one and so many other ones that were in that line are just such great stories.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so many, and you got to play around in different ways. I did a graphic novel called Greenberg the Vampire, which probably most people don't even know about this Jewish mystery writer who's also a vampire. One of my favorite things I've ever done. You could get away with that in a graphic novel, in a Marvel graphic novel, because they were always looking not just for the regular characters, but for odd, interesting, offbeat stories as well. So I have about maybe 15 minutes more, and then I have to go.
Okay. I mean, look, because I had a bunch of questions here, so I want to make sure that I, some of my hits. So, one thing I know that you had done was the Spellbound comics. You did the DeMatteis.
Yes,
is that what you were calling it on the Kickstarter campaign? So, what made you decide that you were going to go to Kickstarter? I've seen a lot of creators going to Kickstarter now to kind of fund it. Is it the idea that you can just have total control over it? Or is there, some other reason behind it?
Yeah, as I said before, I've always gone back and forth between the established characters and my own creator-owned stuff. So I'm always developing these things. And, back in the days of Epic and Vertigo, you actually got paid pretty well to do those projects, and you still owned a good chunk of that project, As the years have passed, there's lots of venues for doing creator-owned work, but 90% of the time you're making money on the back end, if there's any money to be made on the back end. So then why are you even doing it with a publisher, Yeah. And then I was watching all these people doing Kickstarters, and I thought that'd be a really interesting thing to do, but God, it looks like a lot of work. And I did not have it in my nervous system to run a Kickstarter on my own. So I got friendly through one of my writing classes with a guy named David Baldy, who was a longtime TV writer and producer. He took my class, and we became buddies. And I was talking to him about this, and he said, well, I'll work on it with you, because David, aside from being a great writer and a producer, is a businessman. He has a business that he runs as well. So he's got that business head that I do not have at all. That part of my brain was left out when I was born, the business side. And so we started talking, and he said, well, tell me some of the ideas you have. So I pitched him this one and that one and this one. I pitched him like 4 ideas, thinking we'll pick one, we'll do a 4-issue series. And then David went, well, why don't we do all 4 of them? So the idea was to launch 4 number ones, 4 different genres, 4 different styles, 4 different artists. Ended up with great artists, Sean McManus, Matthew Val Smith, Tom Mandrake, David Baldion, who I worked with on the Ben Reilly series. And then we slipped in a 5th at the end as a special bonus. So it was great to get all these ideas out into the world at the same time, working even with a partner, working on that Kickstarter. That was 30 days of exhaustion, man. But it was it was fun, but it was really, really exhausting. And at the end, the idea was that the people that supported all 4 books got to vote on which one they'd like to see continued. Mm-hmm. Well, what got the most votes was all of them. So as we speak, we are working on the second chapters of all 4 of these books. And I'm pretty much done with the writing. I have a little bit of writing left on one of them, but most of it's done. The artists are working. And so early next year, I hope by February at the latest, we will launch a new Kickstarter for DeMatteis Round 2. So it was really one of the most exciting things I ever been. It was so much fun, first to work with these great artists, to work with David, and to get all these ideas out at once, Mm-hmm. Great.
So you've had, I'd say it's fair to say it's an epic career. It's spanned decades. You've worked for all these different companies. You've gotten to work on so many different characters. When you look back on your career, what are some of your favorite works from it?
Oh God, that's a tough question because, as you said, we're talking about more than 40 years doing this.
So many different genres too. But
I know.
If you were to meet someone new and they asked you what you did, and you said like, "Oh, I write comics," and they said, "What should I read?" What would be the 2 or 3 things that you've done where you said, "Go read this"?
And then there's all the work I've done in animation and TV and film and all this other stuff. It's just all right. Comics. Let's just see. It might have to be more than 3 because I said we're dealing with 40 plus years.
Yeah.
Moonshadow is certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I did an autobiographical graphic novel called Brooklyn Dreams, one of my favorite things I've ever done. The third one, I guarantee half the people or more watching this have never heard of. It's called Abadazad. I did it with Mike Plug for CrossGen. Remember CrossGen?
Yeah. I was gonna. That was one of the questions I had here because I know that book ended after 3 issues, right?
That book ended after 3 issues. Then we sold it to Disney, and we created this hybrid half comics, half prose thing. We did it for Disney, and then that went after three books. They pulled the plug on that. It's one of the great tragedies of my career because I really want to finish that story, and I'm still looking for ways to finish that story.
Maybe Kickstarter.
Well, the problem is Disney owns it.
Oh,
so and figuring out ways to work with Disney to get that back is what we've been working on. So it still might happen. Still might happen. But those 3 are very, very near and dear to my heart. All my work with Keith, all of it, I consider it one massive body of work, from mm-hmm. Justice League right through to Scooby Apocalypse. And really, the creator-owned work is so personal that almost all of it is I have to say, from Seekers into the Mystery to Moonshadow and Blood, Girl in the Bay, so many different stories that I've done over the years. But I guess if I'm trying to think, certainly the Spider-Man work is almost like a whole volume into itself too. There's certainly Craven, and there's the stuff I did with Sal on Spec Spider-Man. And I'll stop now because there's so much of it. But again, Dr. Fate, the Spectre, these are stories that really mean something to me.
Yeah, it's so you've gotten to work on so many characters. Are there any characters that you either have not gotten to work on or that you've only got to work on a very little bit that you'd really like to go and kind of either do a mini series or like an ongoing with and like really, tackle them for a long story that you haven't gotten to do yet?
Yeah. Well, the sad part is when people ask me that question, my standard answer until a month or so ago was I want to do Fantastic Four with Keith and with Kevin Maguire.
Oh, that would have been.
And now Keith's not here. We can't do it, because I love the Fantastic Four. And Keith and I had talked about it at various points with Kevin. And I just think it would have been so perfect for what the 3 of us do together to do the Fantastic Four.
I would have loved to seen the stuff that you did with the interactions between Human Torch and Thing.
Yeah, with all of that, because the Fantastic Four could be a very funny book. Stan was a very funny writer, and they kind of worked like me and Keith. Kirby would do these plots and set everything up, and then Stan would write whatever the hell he felt like writing on top of Kirby's plots. So I would still like to do, maybe just with Kevin, but it'd be kind of heartbreaking to do it without Keith. It's great. It's a cliche to say it's a great loss, but it's really a great loss. I mean, he was just an amazing, amazing creator and a really great guy. What other characters? I love all the DC Supernatural characters.
Mm-hmm.
Any chance I get to do that, I did a Constantine animated movie called City of Demons. I'm really, really proud of. I'd love to, play with Constantine, the Spectre, go back to iVampire, any of those characters. And at Marvel, I love Doctor Strange. We did the graphic novel with Dan Green. I did a short run on the Doctor Strange series, but it got canceled. So we never got to get to where we wanted to get to with it. I'd love to return to Doctor Strange. And, the fact is, tomorrow the phone could ring with some character I'm not even thinking about. And I'll go, oh, yeah, I want to do that. And that's the fun of it, because you never know. You just never know.
Are there any other creators out there that you haven't gotten a chance to work with that you'd really be like, man, I'd love to do a book with this artist, or I'd love to team up with this writer on something?
Yeah, there's so many artists out there, and if I start naming one or two, I'm going to leave out 200 of them, But, sometimes I'm scrolling through Instagram, and it's mostly, comic book people that I'm following, and it's just all this great art, one after the other, So there are a million of them that I would love to work with. And the fun is also discovering someone new. Like, I have all my favorites, like even working on the DeMatteis. Tom Mandrake is someone whose work I've loved for years. He did a couple of fill-in issues of Scooby, but we never really got to do a meaty project together. So he's doing Wisdom, our supernatural Western. What a great thing to work with Tom Mandrake after loving his work for years. But then one of the other guys who worked on the DeMatteis was David Baldion. I worked with him on Ben Reilly's Spider-Man. I had never heard of David. Never heard of him. And I fell in love with his work. So when it's the old favorites, and then you get these new guys come along. There's a new artist, and I can't talk about it because we haven't announced the project on this project I'm doing for Marvel now. Never heard of him. He's wonderful. So that's fun too, to discover new people as well. And that's the joy of this business, because there's always somebody new and amazing coming up. And then there's all these other guys. I just worked with Todd Nauck on Magneto. He'd been around for years, and so have I. We never worked together. What a pleasure to work with him. Fantastic artist, great story, great storyteller. It was such a joy to work with him, and I'm really, really proud of that series. I would think in a couple of months the collected edition will be out, if anyone missed the series, because the last issue did.
I got it right here. I actually just finished reading the 4th issue of it yesterday.
Oh, great. So I'm looking forward to the collected edition of that. So yeah, there are always surprises. There's always the next artist that you want to work with, and the artist, Sean McManus, he did Layla in the Lands of After for the DeMatteis. We worked together on Dr. Fate, a couple of things for years in between, but he's always been one of my all-time favorite collaborators. So to get to work together again on this, fantastic, The best part of working in comics, the absolute best part, well, there's two best parts. One is that moment when that door in your unconscious opens up and suddenly there's a movie playing in your head and you have to sit down and get that story down. The other is you've turned in the story, you get an email, and there's the art. And when I get the art, I'm that 10-year-old kid again on my living room floor reading a comic book, because it's magic. It's magic. Whatever's in my head has suddenly come to life by these amazing artists, and it's still one of the biggest thrills of working in this business, is seeing what these incredible artists do with my stories and how they bring them to life. It's great. Really, really great.
Well, you just mentioned the Magneto series. It just the last issue of it just came out. I think like 2 weeks ago, which I really dug it. The way I found out about the series, because I follow, Todd Nauck's one of my favorite artists. I follow him on Instagram, and he had posted on there when the series was getting ready to start. I'm like, oh, I got to pick this up. And then I saw you were the writer. I was like, I mean, that's even better. So, that series just ended for Marvel, and it was, if anybody hasn't read it, I'd highly recommend it. It takes place in the past, when Magneto was in charge of the New Mutants. So you just finished that up for Marvel. What projects do you have coming up that we can
we can talk about? I got one for Marvel and one for DC that I can't talk about. we are launching the next round of the DeMatteis. So that's 4 or 5 books that I'm working on there. And one of the joys of the past couple of years is I've gotten back to prose work. So 2 years ago, no, about a year and a half ago, I put out a novella called The Excavator, which you can find on Amazon. Piece of work I'm really, really proud of. And with 10 beautiful illustrations by my friend, Greek artist named Vasilis Kalexis. But it was so great to get back to writing prose again. And just in September, my new novella, The Witness, came out. 10 illustrations by J.H. Williams III, one of the best artists working right now.
Oh yeah.
And I'm working on a new novella now that will be out next year. So between the novella, the Marvel project, the DC project, the DeMatteis, and some other things floating around the edges, I'm very, very busy, very, very busy. But I would encourage people, if you're not familiar with my prose work, to go check out The Excavator and check out The Witness. I think you will enjoy them.
And I feel bad. I typed this in and I forgot to put this up, for the entire interview here. We'll put this up. You could check him out online at his website right here. And I know you've got other socials, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads. I'm on Facebook. I've been very active on Twitter, and honestly, the way things are going on Twitter now, I'm dialing that back. I'll still be on Twitter, but I'm going to try to focus on these other places a little bit more, because Twitter has become a very dicey place to be these days.
Yeah, it's not a fun ride on there.
No, and it's a shame, because it's a great place. I love interacting with the people that read the work, and if you kind of narrow your focus and just focus on the positive and on those people and on your friends. But when you have a guy running the site who's doing and saying some of the really insane, screwed up stuff that he does, it's like, how long do it's a balance. How long do you put up with it? So yeah. I will still have a presence there. I'm not going to give it up, because you need to promote the work across all these platforms. Mm-hmm. But my focus is going to shift a lot more to these other places.
All right. Well, yeah, check him out online at his.
That's my website. That's right. You can, and like I said, I love to interact with people. So if you come to my website and you leave a comment, I'm going to answer you. If you come and you talk to me on social media, I'm going to do my best to interact with you and chat with you. So I enjoy that.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I set this up. I just sent you a message like, "Hey, would you like to sit down and do an interview with us?" And you were gracious enough to say yes. And I thank you for taking time out of your day to sit down here and talk with me. I had an absolute blast. And there's so much more. Your career is so long. There's so much more stuff to talk with you about.
And there's more to come.
Yeah, so I'd like to, if you're willing, sometime in the future, maybe when you're getting ready to launch the next Kickstarter.
Oh, when we're launching the next Kickstarter, I'll tell you now, I will come back.
Oh, fantastic.
I will come back, because it's really what I learned was you really have to beat the drum for these things.
Yeah.
When we did the first one, I think in a month's time I did 20 podcasts.
Wow. Yeah.
I got so sick of myself. It was really.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone else out here is sick of talking. I mean, I've had a blast talking with you. So it
was a pleasure talking to you too. Thanks.
Thank you for taking the time. And for everyone out there, make sure to check out like I said, the Magneto series that just ended. Like he said, it's going to probably have a collected volume come out in the next month or two. Check out his website below, and you will be able to see everything that he has going on there. And for us, make sure you check us out online at thecodexstation.com. We got links to all of our socials on there. We've got stuff where you can meet all the different creators that that we do these shows on here. So check us out on there. And again, thank you for taking time to sit down and talk with me today.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. I had a great time.
Me too. Thank you. And for everyone else out there, until next time, I'll catch you by the spinner rack.